In 1932, all art styles were banned in the Soviet Union with the sole exception of Socialist Realism. With this act, Stalinism exhibited its ambivalent attitude towards modern progress. On the one hand, the influx of progress was accelerated. The Soviet regime tried tirelessly to buy the most advanced Western technology and hire Western experts to modernize the economy and emulate the most advanced Western factories, farms, and infrastructure. Combined with a socialist system, Soviet technological development was to far surpass Western progress. On the other hand, the Soviet regime erected deadly barricades to shield the Soviet Union from Western modernity. The barricades kept historical change outside the empire. The replacement of the entire art world with socialist realism brought all cultural progress to a standstill. In this sense, the empire became a timeless isle, separated from bourgeois cultural progress. These two measures formed an antithetical interplay of accelerationism and decoupling from historical advancement. But after Stalin's death, Soviet officials began to talk openly about how this dual movement may have been based on a chain of demoralizing atrocities and a propagation of ignorance and prejudice that had set Soviet society back decades in cultural terms. With the end of Stalinism in the Soviet Union, the barricades against bourgeois progress and historical change began to crumble. The Soviet Union attempted to slowly open its borders and become part of the cultural history that was happening outside. In the course of this very cautious opening of Soviet culture, the sole reign of the timeless utopia of socialist realism was weakened, and new art styles began to evolve and spread in the Soviet Union. In this video, I will present two of these post-Stalinist art movements, traditional realism and Sots realism. As in the first video, this cannot be an exhaustive analysis of these art styles, but merely the presentation of some of their basic concepts. Both art forms are still prominent in Russia today and reflect some prominent aspects of present-day Russian society. However, I would like to emphasize that they are not an exhaustive representation of the whole of contemporary Russian culture. After Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalinism 3 years after Stalin's death, the total ban on any art form other than socialist realism was relaxed. Many artists returned from exile and the Gulag. Socialist realism remained the only official sanctioned art style, but unofficial art could now be exhibited in private homes, and previously banned books became accessible. In this environment, a more traditional realism spread throughout the Soviet Union. Its most typical and influential representative was probably Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn not only fiercely criticized Stalinism, but also offered a new ideology based on the idea of a rebirth of the Russian Empire. It eventually became the dominant ideology in the post-Stalinist Soviet Union. However, Solzhenitsyn's criticism and the way he presented his point of view was too radical for the Soviet functionaries at the time, and he was sent into exile. Many Russian artists, literary critics, philosophers, and other intellectuals were part of this traditionalist movement, which can be described as a Russian traditional realism in contrast to socialist realism. According to them, the Russian people were a Christ-like figure. They endured all the plagues brought upon them by the West. The October Revolution, the Civil War, and the Stalinist terror epitomized the Western nihilism that infiltrated the Russian Empire. Yet, throughout all their suffering, the Russian people remained completely innocent in their essence. Next to a moralistic interpretation of Christianity, this new traditionalist ideology included a nationalist ecology and a new Slavophile concept of the Russian Empire. One of the literary genres that belonged to this traditionalist movement was the so-called village prose. It painted an idealized picture of village life in the Soviet Union and showed how the disintegration of the family, moral decay, indifference and consumerism, all of which were identified with city life and cosmopolitanism, destroyed the idyllic traditional life of Russian villagers. Another popular genre was the spy novel. One example is the political thriller On the Last Frontier by Valentin Pikul, who was one of the most widely read authors in the Soviet Union. In this historical novel about the fall of the Russian Empire, he dramatized Rasputin's influence on the Tsar. He portrayed him as an instrument of ruthless cosmopolitans and, sometimes more directly, Jewish Freemasons. Already beginning with the 1960s, the communist dreams of a new man and a new society were slowly replaced by the idea of the divine nature of the Russian people and the eternal values they embodied. Official Soviet circles still referred to the classics of Marxism-Leninism, but their interpretation and the atmosphere in general were characterized by Russian traditionalism. And although this traditionalism included a critique of Stalinism, there are many similarities. For example, the nationalist ecology of the village writers can already be found in the famous Stalinist novel The Russian Forest. Both ideologies also share their collectivist nature, and there are similarities between Stalin's doctor's plot and the antisemitism of the neo-traditionalist writers. Furthermore, the traditionalist artists are just as convinced to understand the spirit of the past as avant-garde and socialist realist artists were to understand the spirit of the future. They want to completely reorganize society themselves to create a monolithic, harmonious culture. And by returning to a more traditional role of the artist, they try to create impenetrable autonomous artistic worlds, each of which claims to possess the ultimate truth about the world. Thus, the single utopia of the classical avant-garde and Stalinism has been replaced by a myriad of private, individual utopias. This pseudo-aristocratic attitude, however, ignores the fact that it reproduces in miniature the absolutist ambition of socialist realism. By the end of the 1970s at the latest, many aspects of neo-traditionalist ideology had become dominant in the official and unofficial circles in the Soviet Union. The official circles were more moderate and endeavored to use Marxist-Leninist language. The Marxist vocabulary remained the same, but it slowly changed its meaning, referring more and more to a philosophy of Russian essentialism and less to a historical communist project. The Stalinist dream of the new socialist man was now reinterpreted as the embodiment of the eternal human ideal of a better life and the centuries-old moral values that had been corrupted by the West, but had been preserved in the Russian people. The official circles suppressed radical forms of traditionalism and harsh criticism of Stalinism whenever they became dangerous for the state, as in the case of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. In general, however, they supported traditional realism, and many famous Soviet novels and films published in the 1970s were neo-traditionalist. The will to appropriate Western progress in order to destroy it was the basis for the complicity between the state and the artist, whether he belonged to the avant-garde, socialist realism, or traditional realism. It was a profound complicity between state and intelligentsia that would have been impossible in the West. The post-Utopian art style Sots-Art realism was a commentary on this complicity. It emerged in the early 1970s as a reflection on the utopian ambitions to halt modern progress. Eric Bulatov's The Horizon is one of the first examples of Sots-Art. The painting shows a group of people in typical Soviet dress walking towards the horizon. The picture was painted in the style of socialist realist photography, and the movement towards the horizon is an allusion to the optimism of socialist realism. But unexpectedly, the horizon is blocked by a suprematist form. For the avant-garde, the horizon symbolized the prison of humanity. Kazimir Malevich proudly proclaimed, "I have destroyed the ring of the horizon and got out of the circle of objects. The horizon ring that has imprisoned the artist and the forms of nature. This accursed ring, by a continually revealing novelty after novelty, leads the artist away from the aim of destruction." For Bulatov, on the other hand, the suprematist form does not liberate the artist, but imprisons him. The form imposes itself on the picture and destroys the illusion of space and movement of the realistic painting. The meticulously realistic construction of perspective is undermined. But the red square is not just a suprematist form. The two golden lines transform it into something else. Soviet citizens would have easily recognized the form as the ribbon of the Order of Lenin, the highest award in the Stalinist Soviet Union. In this way, Malevich's suprematist form is ideologically decoded. This motive is repeated in another work by Bulatov. Here too, a group of people in typical Soviet clothing walk away from the viewer in the direction of Malevich's black square, except that, instead of the black square, we see a poster of Lenin dressed in black. In his further works, Bulatov continued to combine the realistic three-dimensional pictures of socialist realism with the flatness of suprematism, sometimes only in the form of a slogan. In this way, Bulatov's works question the naturalness of realist art. In a world saturated with ideology, neutrality becomes impossible, and the artist cannot step out of the role of the demiurge who opens or closes reality. The space of life proves to be an ideological sign. Although he does not wish to be a demiurge and ideologue, he is aware that he is precisely that. Rather than reject the role that has been imposed upon him, he analyzes it from within, demonstrating the transition from the visual image to the ideological manipulation of the image, and vice versa. The disappearance of the horizon has brought with it not liberation, but the necessity of continually creating it anew. Sots-Art ironically exposes the mechanisms of socialist realism from within. It did so by combining socialist realism with Western pop art, hence the name Sots-Art. Western pop art emerged in the 1950s and 60s and took cheap products destined for mass consumption and elevated them to the status of expensive artworks. This was simultaneously a critique of the capitalist economy as well as the traditional notion of high art. Sots-Art, on the other hand, emerged in a society in which there was neither a Western-style consumer market nor an art market. In the Soviet Union, the value of ideological signs, including artworks, was defined by the sign's positioning within the symbolic economy, whose currencies were social recognition and political acceptance. The main goal of Sots-Art was to reveal the mechanisms and mirror the deep ambiguities of this symbolic economy. It took the slogans, banners, and images of communist leaders and presented them outside of the official ideological context of socialist realism. Without this context, they lost their sacrosanct aura and their function of educating the masses. And yet, this kind of blasphemous use of official ideological signs constituted the true popular culture of late Soviet civilization. It was a culture composed primarily of jokes of varying degrees of dirtiness that made fun of Soviet rituals, leaders, and slogans. And of course, the Soviet elite participated in this culture. In the Brezhnev era of 1964 to 82, a powerful position in the party hierarchy came to be regarded mainly as a way of getting permission to travel abroad and buy Western goods, including anti-Soviet literature. Sots-Art had an ambitious status as unofficial art that was censored but at the same time somehow tolerated by the regime. The party elite seemed to be glad that the ideology was circulating at all, even if it took the form of blasphemous jokes. It meant that it was still reproduced and not completely irrelevant. In Western terms, any publicity is good publicity. Many Soviet citizens celebrated the 1st of May or the October Revolution in the same way that non-Christians celebrate Christmas. They did not believe in it and made jokes about it, but they also did not hate it and saw it as part of the everyday experience of Soviet culture to which they felt they belonged. Other artists from the unofficial art milieu disliked Sots-Art for spreading Soviet symbols, even if it was outside of its ideological context. They thought that true protest consisted not in ironic remarks and criticism from within, but in ignoring the Soviet ideology. Meaningful artistic resistance can only be found in classical Russian art. They perceived Soviet culture as a world permeated with socialist realist kitsch and referred to Dostoevsky when they diagnosed the Avant-Garde and Stalinist art as nihilistic. Sots artists criticized them in turn and mocked their over-serious attempt to mobilize an elitist high culture to criticize the Soviet reality and their inability to realize that they were just repeating the actions of the avant-garde and socialist realism. Sots art survived the end of the Soviet Union, but post-Soviet Sots-Art has lost most of its criticism. The oligarchs love it, and many neo-Sots artists love them back. And although it is pro-Western and anti-nationalist in its ironic affirmation of Western consumerism, it is not perceived as a threat by the Russian regime, as it is only very rarely anti-government. Only the church has reservations. Post-Soviet Sots-Art does not only combine Western consumer goods with nostalgia for the Soviet culture, but also makes use of the symbols of Orthodox Christianity. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Sots artists found their love for the Orthodox Church. Yet the Orthodox Church does not love them back. With increasing success, it calls on the government to ban the use of Christian symbols in Sots art and prevent the emergence of Orth art. All of the art styles that tried to anticipate the future failed. Only Sots art, which did not, was successful. It was meant to be deliberately ironic and not futuristic or sociologically correct. And yet, contemporary Russia looks a lot like Sots art. Right next to Lenin's mausoleum, you can find stores filled with Western luxury goods. And on Russian state television, Orthodox priests consecrate an old Soviet long-range rocket still decorated with a red star. This missile is then used to kill people in another predominantly Orthodox country to demonstrate Russia's superiority over the West. All the while, deadly serious Russian philosophers mobilize the concepts of the neo-traditionalist movement in treatises to support the absurd actions of the Russian state, and then fight over who best justifies the madness.